Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Julian Sterling laughed as he tipped his crystal glass, letting a dark stream of Pinot Noir splash across Elena Sterling's cream-colored silk blouse in front of the entire board of directors. The red stain bloomed like a fresh wound against the expensive fabric, a silent testament to his malice. The dining room of the Sterling estate, usually a sanctuary of refined elegance, suddenly felt like a theater of cruelty. The air was thick with the scent of roasted rosemary and the heavy, metallic tang of the spilled wine. "Oh, Elena," Julian said, his voice dripping with a performative sympathy that didn't reach his cold, predatory eyes. "You always were a bit clumsy. Perhaps the city life has made you soft, or maybe you're just overwhelmed by seeing what a real legacy looks like." Elena didn't flinch. She felt the cold dampness of the wine seeping through her camisole, the liquid chilling against her skin, but she kept her spine rigid. Across the long mahogany table, Silas Sterling looked down at his plate, his hands trembling as he gripped his silver fork. The patriarch looked older than he had 6 months ago, his face a map of exhaustion and disappointment. Clara Sterling, Julian's wife, sat frozen to his right, her knuckles white as she gripped her napkin, her eyes darting toward the board members who were carefully studying their salads. "It's just a dress, Julian," Elena said, her voice low and steady. She reached for her water glass, her fingers grazing the cool, condensation-beaded surface. "Stains can be removed. Some things, however, are permanent." Julian leaned back, the gold links of his Rolex catching the light of the crystal chandelier. He smirked, the expression of a man who believed he had already won the game. Spoken like a true forensic accountant, always looking for the mess, never the big picture. "While you've been busy auditing mid-sized firms in Chicago, I've been keeping this family from insolvency. You should be thanking me, not judging the way I run the table." One of the board members, a man Elena recognized as a longtime family friend, cleared his throat uncomfortably. The social pressure in the room was suffocating, a physical weight that pressed against Elena's chest. Julian was the golden boy, the visionary who had supposedly saved Sterling Holdings from the brink. Elena was the prodigal daughter, the number cruncher, who had stayed away while the house burned. "I didn't come back to judge Julian," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "I came back because the numbers didn't add up, and I've always been very good at making things balance." Julian's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something paranoia, perhaps crossing his face before he masked it with a sharp, bark-like laugh. "The numbers are fine. The board is happy. Father is comfortable. You're just looking for a reason to feel relevant again." He turned to the man seated next to him, his tone dismissive. "She's always been like this, obsessed with the fine print while the world moves on without her." Mrs. Gable entered the room then, her footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. She moved to Elena's side, offering a damp linen cloth with a look of quiet, fierce loyalty. Elena took it, her hand briefly brushing the older woman, S. Mrs. Gable had been the one to call her, the one who whispered over the phone about Julian's late-night meetings and the way Silas had started forgetting where the deed to the North acreage was kept. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Elena whispered. "I'll have the laundry maid look at it immediately, Miss Elena," the housekeeper replied, her voice a steady anchor in the storm of Julian's arrogance. Elena stood, the silk of her dress clinging uncomfortably to her skin. "If you'll excuse me, I'd like to change before the main course. I wouldn't want to ruin the aesthetic of Julian's perfect evening." "Don't take too long," Julian called out as she turned toward the door. "We're discussing the Thorn development after dinner. You know, the one that's going to double our dividends. Or is that too much big picture for you to handle?" Elena didn't answer. She walked out of the dining room, the sound of her heels clicking sharply against the cold marble of the foyer. She didn't head for her old bedroom. Instead, she slipped into the darkened study, the scent of old leather and cedarwood enveloping her. She reached into her small clutch and pulled out a slim, silver flash drive. Marcus Thorne had been more than helpful in providing the initial data, but she needed the local server access to prove what she already suspected. Julian wasn't a visionary. He was a scavenger, picking the bones of their father's legacy clean to cover a trail of gambling debts that stretched from Atlantic City to Macau. She moved to the desk, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't have much time. Outside, she could hear the muffled sound of Julian's laughter echoing from the dining room, followed by the clink of a toast. He was celebrating his victory, unaware that the sister he had just humiliated was currently standing in the dark, holding the key to his ruin. She plugged the drive into the workstation and watched the screen glow to life. Her fingers flew across the keys, the familiar rhythm of data entry soothing her frayed nerves. She bypassed the first layer of encryption, then the second. Julian was arrogant, but he wasn't a technician. He had used the same password for the corporate accounts that he used for his country club locker. The file directory opened. Elena's breath hitched. There, buried under a shell company titled Sterling Growth Initiatives, was a series of transfers totaling nearly $4 million. All of them had been diverted from the employee pension fund over the last 6 months. But it wasn't just the theft that stopped her heart. It was the destination. Elena stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in her eyes. The money hadn't gone to a casino or a creditor. It had been funneled into a private account held in her own name. Julian wasn't just stealing the family fortune. He was setting her up to take the fall for its collapse. A floorboard creaked behind her. Elena froze, her hand hovering over the mouse as the shadow of a man lengthened across the mahogany desk. The following morning, the sun bled through the towering arched windows of the Sterling Manor breakfast room, but the warmth failed to reach Elena Sterling. She sat at the long mahogany table, her fingers curled tightly around a porcelain cup of Earl Grey. Across from her, Julian Sterling was casually scrolling through his phone, his designer silk tie loosened at the collar. He looked every bit the relaxed heir, a stark contrast to the man who had loomed in the shadows of the office only hours before. "You're quiet today, Elena," Julian said, his voice smooth and dripping with a feigned, fraternal concern. He didn't look up, but the smirk playing at the corners of his mouth was unmistakable. "Late night in the library. I hope you weren't overtaxing yourself. We need you sharp for the Foundation Gala on Friday." Silas Sterling sat at the head of the table, his face a map of exhaustion and fading authority. He reached for his water glass, his hand trembling with a rhythmic frailty that made Elena's chest ache. "She's always been the diligent one, Julian, unlike some who treat the family firm like a personal playground." Julian's eyes flickered with a brief, ugly spark of resentment before he masked it with a dry chuckle. He set his phone down with a sharp clack against the marble-top table. "Actually, Father, that's why I've decided to move Elena into a more central role. I've officially appointed her as the lead auditor for the employee pension fund, starting today." Elena felt a cold spike of adrenaline. He wasn't just framing her, he was publicly handing her the smoking gun. By making her the lead auditor, any discovery of the missing $4 million would look like her own botched cover-up. It was a brilliant, sociopathic move. "Is that so?" Elena asked, her voice a calm, level blade. She met his gaze, refusing to blink. "The pension fund is a heavy responsibility, Julian. Are you sure you want me looking that closely at the books?" "I insist." He leaned forward, the scent of his expensive, sandalwood cologne cloying in the morning air. "In fact, I've already moved all the relevant files into your private server. No one else has access. It's your project now. Entirely." Clara Sterling drifted into the room then, her heels clicking sharply against the checkerboard marble. She looked immaculate in a cream-colored sheath dress, but her eyes were guarded as she placed a hand on Julian's shoulder. "He's only trying to help you integrate back into the family, Elena. You've been gone so long. People are starting to whisper that you don't belong in the Sterling legacy anymore." The insult hung in the air, bolstered by the rhythmic, heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Clara didn't even look at her. She simply began adjusting Julian's lapel, her movements possessive and performative. "I belong exactly where I am," Elena replied. She reached into her silk blazer pocket, her thumb brushing the cold, metallic edge of the USB drive she had hidden there. She had spent the hours between 3 and 5 in the morning at a 24-hour diner 3 towns over, using a burner laptop to mirror the encrypted files she'd stolen from Julian's computer. He thought he had trapped her in a digital cage, but he had no idea she'd already picked the lock and built a back door. Mrs. Gable entered the room to clear the plates, the scent of fresh lavender and furniture polish following her. The housekeeper's eyes met Elena's for a fleeting second, a look of silent, weary sympathy before she moved on. 3 days, Elena, Julian said, standing up and smoothing his jacket. The gala is the deadline. I expect a full report on the fund's health before we take the stage. Don't disappoint the family. Father's heart couldn't take another scandal. He turned and walked away, his stride full of the unearned confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. Clara followed him like a loyal shadow, leaving Elena alone with the ghost of her father's legacy. Elena waited until the sound of Julian's car faded down the gravel driveway. She pulled out her phone and sent a single encrypted message to Marcus Thorne. The trap is set. He thinks I'm the bait, but I'm the hunter. Check the cloud. She looked at Silas, who had fallen into a light, fitful doze in his chair. The countdown had begun. 72 hours until the Sterling Foundation Gala. 72 hours to turn Julian's masterpiece of betrayal into his own public execution. Elena stood, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound like sharpening steel. She didn't feel like a victim anymore. She felt like a reckoning. 2 days later, the morning sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Marcus Thorne's penthouse office, glinting off the polished chrome of a desk that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. Elena stood by the glass, watching the rhythmic pulse of the city below. Her reflection in the window showed a woman who had finally stopped flinching. "It's worse than we thought," Marcus said, his voice low and gravelly. He didn't look up from the 3 monitors glowing on his desk. The scent of expensive espresso and ozone from the server racks filled the room, a sharp, clinical contrast to the musty grief of the Sterling manor. He wasn't just covering gambling debts. He was selling off the foundation's land assets to a holding company in the Caymans, a company he owns. Elena turned, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. She looked at the screen where a web of red lines connected the Sterling Foundation to a dozen shell corporations. Her brother hadn't just been reckless, he had been predatory. He was cannibalizing their father's life's work while the old man sat upstairs dreaming of better days. "Can you trace the final signature?" she asked. Marcus tapped a key, and a document bloomed across the center screen. It was a transfer of deed for the Sterling Sanctuary, the low-income housing complex Silas had built in the 90s. Julian's signature was bold, arrogant, and dated only 48 hours ago. "The money hit his personal account this morning," Marcus said. He handed her a sleek, black encrypted drive. "Everything is on here. The wire transfers, the forged board minutes, and the recorded calls with the Cayman's broker. It's a financial guillotine, Elena." She took the drive, the cold metal casing pressing into her palm. "Thank you, Marcus. Make sure the secondary server is live for the gala. I want no possibility of him cutting the feed once I start the presentation." "He won't know what hit him," he replied, a grim smile touching his lips. Elena left the office and drove back to the manor, the weight of the drive in her pocket acting as a talisman. As she entered the grand foyer, the smell of Mrs. Gable's lemon wax hit her, followed immediately by the cloying, heavy scent of Julian's expensive oud cologne. He was standing in the center of the hall, barking orders at 2 workmen who were hauling a heavy mahogany desk toward the service stairs. "Careful with that, you idiots," Julian shouted. He was dressed in a tailored navy suit, his fingers fiddling with a vintage gold watch, the Patek Philippe that had belonged to Silas, the one he had promised to Elena on her 18th birthday. "That's an antique. If you scratch it, it's coming out of your pay." "Julian," Elena asked, her voice deceptively calm, "what are you doing with Father's desk?" He turned, a smirk twisting his handsome, tired face. "It's clutter, Elena. Dad doesn't even know what a desk is for anymore. I'm turning his study into a media room. A man in my position needs a space to decompress after the kind of week I've had. He still uses that room, she said, her nails digging into her palms. He likes the view of the gardens. Julian laughed, a sharp, entitled sound that echoed off the high ceilings. He stepped closer, invading her space, the smell of tobacco and midday scotch rolling off him. Dad likes whatever I tell him to like, and honestly, Elena, you should be thanking me. While you've been playing accountant and moping around the hallways, I've been securing our future. I just closed a deal that's going to put the Sterling name back on top. He reached out and flicked a stray hair off her shoulder, a gesture so patronizing it made her skin crawl. Try to look happy at the gala tomorrow. I've invited the press. I'm announcing a major restructuring of the foundation. It's going to be my masterpiece. I'm sure it will be, she replied, her voice steady. She felt the encrypted drive against her hip. I've already finished the financial health report you asked for. It's illuminating. Good girl, he sneered, already turning back to the workmen. Make sure it's on the teleprompter. I don't want to stumble over the boring parts. Oh, and Clara is in the parlor with some stylist. Do something about your hair, will you? You look like a librarian on a budget. Elena watched him walk away, his stride full of the unearned confidence of a man who believed the world was his for the taking. She heard Clara's high-pitched giggle from the parlor, followed by the sound of a champagne cork popping. They were celebrating a victory they hadn't won yet, drinking to a future that was already evaporating. She walked past the parlor, catching a glimpse of Clara draped in a shimmering silver gown that probably cost more than Silas's medical care for the year. Clara didn't even look up. She was too busy admiring her own reflection in a gilded mirror. Elena climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, where the air was thinner and the house was silent. She stopped at the door to Silas's room. She found him sitting by the window, staring out at the gardens where the workmen were already setting up the white tents for the gala. Elena, he whispered, his eyes clear for a fleeting second. I'm here, Dad, she said, kneeling beside his chair. She took his hand. It was thin, like parchment paper. Julian said. He said the house was too big, Silas murmured, his brow furrowing. He said we were moving. Nobody is moving, Dad, Elena said, her voice dropping to a cold, hard whisper. She looked out at the tents at the stage where Julian expected to be crowned the king of the Sterling Empire. Tomorrow night the house gets very quiet again, I promise. She stood up and looked at the clock on the mantel. 24 hours. The evidence was secured, the witnesses were invited, and the trap was set. Julian Sterling thought he was preparing for a coronation, but Elena was preparing for a funeral. She reached into her pocket and touched the drive one last time. The countdown had reached its final day. Tomorrow, the music would stop, and Julian would finally find out exactly what it cost to betray a Sterling. 12 hours later, the morning of the gala's eve arrived with a deceptive, golden warmth that masked the rot beneath the Sterling estate. Elena stood on the 2nd-floor balcony, watching a small army of caterers and decorators transform the south lawn into a monument to Julian's ego. The scent of thousands of white lilies, the kind usually reserved for weddings or high-profile funerals, drifted up on the breeze, cloying and thick. She felt the cold, hard weight of the flash drive in her pocket. It was a small thing, no larger than a thumb, yet it held the power to dismantle a 30-year legacy of greed. Admiring the view, or just realizing how far you've fallen out of the loop. Julian's voice dripped with the casual cruelty he had perfected since childhood. He stepped onto the balcony, his silk robe billowing, a crystal glass of amber liquid already in his hand despite the early hour. He didn't look at his sister. He looked out at the tents, his chest swelling with the misplaced pride of a conqueror. I was just thinking about the foundations, Julian, Elena said, her voice a calm, steady anchor against his frantic energy. Everything looks beautiful on the surface. But if the soil is sour, the whole thing eventually collapses. He let out a sharp, barking laugh and took a long sip from his glass. God, you've always been so dramatic. Is that what they teach you in forensic accounting? How to find metaphors for failure? Don't worry about the foundations. Worry about your dress. I've invited the entire board, the press, and half the city's elite. I won't have you looking like a charity case at my coronation." Elena turned to face him. She didn't flinch at the insult. Instead, she let her gaze linger on the slight tremor in his hand, the telltale sign of a man who had spent the night staring at mounting debts and dwindling options. "You should be careful, Julian. When you invite the whole world to watch you take a crown, you're also inviting them to watch you fall. Are you absolutely certain the books are as clean as you've told the board?" Julian's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine vitriol breaking through his smug facade. "Do you think I'm an idiot? I've handled Marcus Thorne. I've handled the auditors. I'm the one saving this family while you were off playing hero with other people's taxes. By this time tomorrow, Silas will sign over the remaining shares, and you'll be lucky if I let you keep your childhood bedroom." "Silas is stronger than you think," she replied softly, "and the truth has a way of being even more stubborn than he is." He stepped closer, invading her space, the smell of expensive scotch and unearned confidence radiating off him. "The truth is whatever I put on the ledger, Elena. Remember that." He tapped the side of his glass against the balcony railing with a sharp clink and sauntered away. As he retreated, Elena noticed Clara standing in the doorway. Julian's wife looked pale, her fingers twisting a diamond tennis bracelet that likely cost more than the average worker's annual salary. She had heard it all. Her eyes met Elena's, and for the first time, the usual mask of socialite indifference was gone. There was a flicker of something else, fear, perhaps, or a dawning realization that the ship she was tethered to was hitting an iceberg. "He doesn't mean it, Elena," Clara whispered, though she didn't sound convinced. "He's just under a lot of pressure." "Pressure creates diamonds, Clara," Elena said, stepping past her toward the stairs. "But it also crushes things that are hollow inside." She didn't wait for a response. Downstairs, Marcus Thorne was waiting in the foyer, ostensibly to discuss the final logistics of the development deal. When their eyes met, Marcus gave a single, imperceptible nod. The witnesses were confirmed. The legal team was on standby. The trap wasn't just set, the bait was already being swallowed. Elena walked out the front door, the countdown in her head hitting the 20-hour mark. Julian thought he was preparing for a celebration of his genius. He had no idea that every guest he invited was another nail in the coffin of his career. The stage was set, the audience was coming, and the only thing left was for the curtain to rise on the wreckage of his lies. The evening of the gala arrived with a deceptive, suffocating elegance. By 7 o'clock, the Sterling estate had been transformed into a glittering cathedral of glass and light, the air heavy with the cloying scent of white lilies and the expensive, metallic tang of chilled champagne. Julian stood at the center of the grand ballroom, his silhouette sharp in a midnight blue tuxedo that caught the glare of the crystal chandeliers. He was holding court, his laughter echoing with the practiced, hollow resonance of a man who believed he had finally outrun his own shadow. Elena watched him from the shadows of the mezzanine, her fingers tracing the smooth, cold edge of the flash drive tucked into her velvet clutch. Downstairs, the elite of the city's development world mingled with the Sterling board members, their voices a low, rhythmic hum beneath the strains of a live string quartet. She could see Silas seated in a high-backed wing chair near the fireplace. Her father looked smaller than he had only 2 days ago, his pale eyes fixed on Julian with a mixture of confusion and a flickering, painful hope. "He looks like he's already won," a low voice murmured beside her. Elena didn't turn to see Marcus Thorne. She didn't need to. The scent of his cedarwood cologne was a grounding anchor in the sea of floral perfume. The higher the pedestal, Marcus, the more spectacular the shatter. "The legal team is positioned near the tech booth," Marcus said, his voice barely a breath. "The moment Julian starts the presentation, the server override will engage. Every guest in this room is about to see the real Sterling ledger." Elena nodded, her gaze returning to her brother. Julian was currently cornering a group of investors, his gestures wide and theatrical. He looked every bit the visionary heir, the savior of a legacy he had actually spent the last 18 months dismantling. She began her descent, her heels clicking a steady, lethal rhythm against the marble stairs. As she reached the floor, Julian spotted her. He didn't offer a smile. Instead, his lip curled in that familiar, predatory sneer he reserved for those he considered beneath him. He excused himself from the investors and intercepted her near the buffet, his movements aggressive and territorial. "I'm surprised you showed up, Elena," Julian said, his voice dripping with a condescending pity that made her skin crawl. He adjusted his silk cufflinks, a Rolex shimmering on his wrist, a watch she knew had been purchased with money meant for the staff's pension fund. "I thought you'd be halfway to the airport by now, fleeing back to your dusty spreadsheets before you had to watch me become the man you never could be." "I wouldn't miss this for the world, Julian," she replied, her voice a calm, frigid contrast to his frantic energy. "It's not every day a person gets to see the culmination of so much hard work." He leaned in closer, the smell of expensive scotch and unearned confidence radiating off him. "Look around. These people aren't here for the Sterling name anymore. They're here for me. By tomorrow morning, I'll have the signatures to dissolve the old board and move the remaining assets into the new holding company. You and the old man will be footnotes. I might even buy you a nice little apartment somewhere modest. Somewhere you belong." He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder as if to pat her like a disobedient child, but Elena stepped back, her eyes never leaving his. "You should check your tie, Julian. It's a bit tight. You look like you're struggling to breathe." His face flushed a deep, angry crimson, the mask of the charming host slipping just enough to show the jagged edges of his narcissism. "Enjoy the caviar while you can, Elena. It's the last time you'll taste anything that costs more than $10. He turned on his heel, heading toward the small stage erected at the far end of the room. Clara was standing there, looking like a porcelain doll in a gown that seemed to weigh her down. She caught Elena's eye for a fraction of a second, her expression a haunting blend of guilt and terror. She knew. She didn't know the details, but she knew the house of cards was trembling. Julian reached for the tablet on the lectern, his finger poised to launch the presentation that he believed would solidify his theft. He looked out at the audience, his eyes bright with the fever of a gambler who thought he'd finally hit the jackpot. "Witness the new Sterling," Julian announced, his voice reaching a triumphant crescendo. He tapped the screen. Elena pressed the button. The projector whirred, a bright light lancing across the darkened room. But instead of the sleek architectural renderings of the new development project, a grainy, high-definition image of a bank statement flickered into existence. Elena Sterling stood in the center of the stage, her silhouette a sharp, dark blade against the glowing evidence. Julian Sterling remained frozen beside the podium, his hand still hovering over the laptop as if he could somehow push the truth back into the digital ether. The bank statement on the screen was undeniable, a jagged map of offshore transfers, shell companies, and the systematic bleeding of the Sterling legacy. $40 million, Julian, Elena said, her voice steady and echoing through the hushed ballroom. That wasn't just a rounding error. It was the pension funds for 500 employees. It was the foundation of the new children's wing. It was the soul of this company, sold off to cover your debts in Macau. Julian's face didn't just pale, it seemed to dissolve. The arrogant mask he'd worn like armor for 30 years shattered, leaving behind a frantic, hollow-eyed stranger. His lower lip trembled, a rhythmic, pathetic twitch that he couldn't control, while his skin took on the gray, waxy sheen of a man who had forgotten how to breathe. His eyes darted wildly toward the exits, then back to the glowing screen, reflecting the cold blue light of his own ruin. Every muscle in his jaw locked, pulling his mouth into a jagged, silent snarl of terror as the weight of the family name finally crushed him. The sweat on his forehead glistened under the stage lights, highlighting the frantic pulse thrumming in his temple like a trapped animal. "It's a fabrication," he croaked, though the microphone clipped to his lapel carried the tremor in his voice to every corner of the room. "Elena is. She's unstable. She's always been jealous of my position. The forensic audit says otherwise, Julian," a voice rang out from the front row. Marcus Thorne stood up, his face a mask of professional coldness. He held a thick manila envelope, the seal already broken. The authorities have the original ledgers you thought were lost in the warehouse fire. My firm has been working with your sister for 6 months. Every offshore account, every forged signature, and every cent you bled from the Sterling Trust has been traced. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Mrs. Gable, who had spent the evening praising Julian's visionary leadership, physically recoiled, pulling her silk wrap tighter around her shoulders as if his presence were suddenly infectious. Beside her, 3 other board members began whispering frantically, their eyes fixed on the exit. The social hierarchy of the room shifted in an instant. Julian was no longer the sun they orbited, but a black hole they were desperate to escape. Silas Sterling moved then. The patriarch, usually so upright and formidable, seemed to age a decade in the span of a single breath. He didn't look at the screen. He looked only at his son. When he spoke, the microphone wasn't necessary. His voice, though low, carried the devastating force of a final judgment. "I gave you everything," Silas said, the words heavy with a grief that surpassed anger. "I gave you my trust, my legacy, and my pride, and you traded it all for a seat at a table that wasn't yours to buy." "Dad, listen to me," Julian started, taking a stumbling step toward the edge of the stage. "Do not call me that," Silas interrupted, his hand trembling as he gripped his cane. "You are a thief who happens to share my blood, nothing more." The rejection was absolute. Clara Sterling, who had been standing near the wings of the stage, didn't offer a hand or a word of comfort. She watched him with a clinical detachment, her fingers twisting the empty space where her wedding ring had been only moments before. She turned her back on him, walking toward Marcus Thorne to hand him a small USB drive she had been clutching in her palm. The betrayal was a circle, and Julian was finally at its center. 2 men in dark suits stepped from the shadows of the foyer, their footfalls echoing on the marble floor. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. Julian had nowhere left to run. The room watched in morbid fascination as the high-gloss world of the Sterling heir was dismantled in real time. Julian looked out at the sea of faces. People he had bullied, people he had looked down upon, people he had thought he owned. He found no pity. He found only the cold, mirrored reflection of his own cruelty. His knees buckled slightly, his hand reaching out to catch the podium, but he missed. He slumped against the wood, his expensive suit bunching awkwardly, a discarded shell of the man he had pretended to be. The lead investigator reached the stage, his expression grim. "Julian Sterling, you're under arrest for grand larceny, embezzlement, and securities fraud." As the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked shut, a sharp, industrial sound that cut through the murmurs of the elite, Julian finally looked toward the back of the hall. The doors were still closed, but the memory of his sister's calm, steady gaze remained. She hadn't stayed to watch the kill. She had delivered the blow and walked into the light, leaving him to rot in the darkness of his own making. The guests began to filter out, their hushed conversations already dissecting the corpse of his reputation. They stepped around him as if he were a stain on the carpet. By the time the police led him toward the service exit, the grand hall was nearly empty. The only sound left was the hollow hum of a projector displaying a balance sheet that read 0. 6 months after the handcuffs clicked shut in the grand hall, the silence in the Sterling executive suite felt less like a vacuum and more like a long-overdue breath. Elena Sterling sat behind the mahogany desk that had once been her father's, then her brother's, and was now, by unanimous board decree, hers. The scent of expensive cedar polish and fresh rain from the open window filled the room, a sharp contrast to the stale, Scotch-heavy air Julian had favored. She traced the edge of a silver fountain pen, its weight grounding her. On the desk sat a final liquidation report. It was the autopsy of a dynasty. To save Sterling Global, Elena had been forced to amputate the rot, selling off the penthouse, the fleet of Italian sports cars, and the vineyard Julian had used as his personal playground. The heavy door latched with a soft, expensive thud. Silas Sterling walked in, his gait slower than it had been half a year ago. The patriarch's hair had gone fully silver, and the sharp fire in his eyes had softened into a weary kind of grace. He didn't head for the power chair. Instead, he sat in the guest leather armchair, looking at his daughter with a mixture of pride and profound sorrow. "The sentencing was finalized this morning," Silas said, his voice gravelly. 10 years, Elena. No chance of parole for the first 6. Elena didn't feel the surge of triumph she had expected. Instead, she felt a cold, clean sense of equilibrium. "He earned every day of it, Dad." "I know." Silas looked out at the skyline. "Clara called me. She's moved into a small 2-bedroom in the suburbs. She's working as an interior consultant now. She told me she finally stopped waking up with her heart racing in the middle of the night. She's happy in her own way." It was the ultimate karma for Julian. The wife he had treated as a trophy, a mere accessory to his curated life, had found peace the moment he was removed from her world. Clara hadn't visited him once. She had changed her number and signed the divorce papers before his first bail hearing was even denied. The intercom buzzed, and the steady voice of Mrs. Gable came through. "Miss Sterling, Marcus Thorne is here for the quarterly review." "Send him in, Mrs. Gable," Elena replied. Marcus stepped into the office, looking every bit the ally he had proven to be. He carried a leather portfolio, but his expression was light. He caught Elena's eye and offered a small, knowing smile, a silent acknowledgement of the war they had survived together. "The recovery is ahead of schedule," Marcus said, bypassing the formalities as he laid out the charts. "The markets have responded to the transparency. Investors like the new Sterling Global. They like that the books actually match the bank accounts." "And the restitution?" Elena asked. "Every employee Julian defrauded has been made whole," Marcus confirmed. "The last of his personal assets, the watch collection and the offshore accounts we recovered, covered the final balance. He's officially broke, Elena. He'll walk out of that facility in a decade with nothing but the clothes the state gives him." Elena looked at the balance sheet. It was a victory, but it had come at the cost of her brother's soul and her father's health. She thought of Julian in his cell, stripped of the bespoke suits that had been his armor, forced to exist in a world where his name carried no weight and his charm had no currency. He was finally seeing the man in the mirror without the filter of inherited wealth, and she knew that for a narcissist like him, the anonymity was a sharper punishment than the bars. Silas stood up, placing a hand on Elena's shoulder. "I'm going home. Mrs. Gable mentioned she's making that roast you like. Don't stay too late." "I won't," she promised. As her father and Marcus left, Elena stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. Below, the city hummed with indifferent energy. She pulled a small, framed photograph from her drawer, the only one she hadn't thrown away. It was a picture of her and Julian as children, standing on the lawn of the old estate before the greed had taken root. She looked at the boy in the photo, then at the empty, darkened office across the hall that had once been his. The justice was proportional, the revenge was complete, and the Sterling name had been scrubbed clean. But as she set the photo face down on the desk, Elena realized the true price of the win. She had saved the empire, but she was the last one left to rule it. The lion had woken up, the wolf had been caged, and for the first time in her life, the silence was finally her own.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.